My name is Kit McMahon. For those of you who don't know me, it's my privilege and pleasure to work for an organisation called Women's Health in the South East. Before I begin though today, I do really want to make sure that we all take a moment to recall, remember and centre that we are all on unceded lands of First Nations people, Aboriginal people. I'm coming to you today from the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung lands. I pay my respects to elders past and present, and I also acknowledge the lands that you are coming from today, wherever you may be across this great country. Why are we here today? It's probably a very esoteric question to ask on a Tuesday afternoon, but it's important for us. Look, I think the journey of WHISE, we've been part of this work to prevent gender-based violence for nearly 30 years of our history, and always seeking to know what else we need to be doing in our practice, very much situated in local and implementation of primary prevention and health promotion work. Over the last few years for us there and our partners, there has been, I guess, increased work on addressing stereotypes, attitudes, and also the systems that negatively impact all genders. And more, this has included men and working with men and how this drives gender-based violence. I guess there's been some concern for some time that perhaps primary prevention of violence does not address or direct energy to the site where violence is perpetrated, and in a way that is aligned to those population-wide approaches. And that's why we're here today, is to try to deepen our understanding about that. In 2022, the two wonderful, amazing people I'm about to introduce you to released a report called Who Uses Domestic, Family and Sexual Violence and Why? The State of Knowledge Report on Violence Perpetration. And for me, this was, and so many of the people I work with, this was a landmark report. It actually reframed the way I thought about violence and intimate partner violence and gendered violence, and how many of us understand, record and report it. I know at the time it was released from Rulula and Michael, the WHISE team were with great energy distributing across to anyone who would listen to us, say, you need to read this. And the envisaging of this online workshop, or this workshop, was something that was planned for quite a few months now, and I'm so glad that we've got it. So today is really to give us the opportunity to listen firsthand to this report, because not everyone's got an opportunity to read, and sometimes we need to hear things and see things a few different times, but also to give ourselves the privilege and the opportunity to discuss it and seek to understand it with a view of saying, well, actually, what does that mean to primary prevention at the local level when we're doing this stuff? So for those of you that are new to us, I also want to let you know who WHISE is and who our partners on this here. We're one of 12 women's health services that, and we are located in the southeast of Victoria, but there are 12 of us across Victoria, and we all do similar priorities, which is about women's health and wellbeing. It's building gender equality, it's addressing gender-based violence, improving sexual reproductive health, improving women's health, women's mental wellbeing, and also addressing the impacts of climate change on women's wellbeing. The truth is that all of these acts actually interrelate together. And when you improve someone's access to health and a sense of choice, you actually also take action to improve equity.
Sorry, Kit, I got a bit excited there and muted you.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Thank you, Danny. The bringing together of this webinar, though, it has to be said, is not something that, you know, Kitty's come up with a hot idea at the back of her head. It's a partnership collection. We're delighted that we can be doing this with input and advice from not only the partners that sit around our table in promoting respect and equality together, that's the Regional Primary Prevention Partnership, but also the incredible partnership at Cardinia Shire Councils Together We Can, and also the Integrated Family Violence Partnerships of Bayside Peninsula and Southern Melbourne. And I think I see Rose Burrell here today, and it's great to have you here today. So again, the goals of why we're here. It's just two things. Let's give our space just to think about two things, perhaps. Understanding why we need to reframe prevention to focus on perpetration, and give us the space to start thinking how we apply this in our work. Structure of today, we're going to give ourselves the opportunity to locate and centre ourselves in the moment and listen and reflect and learn from two great individuals and professionals, Lula Dembele and Professor Michael Flood, and I'll introduce them in a second. We also want to give people the opportunity to share, collaborate and learn. There'll be a Q&A, but we'll also have breakout sessions around key questions. And there will be a break. And one of Danny's jobs is to make sure that I do that, because I keep forgetting that people need to drink water as a rule. Before we begin though, we just want to get a sense of where you're at now. Hopefully you've got one of these to hand. And those that you don't know, this is a product called Slido. What you do is you open your camera and you can go to your camera and take a photo of that QR code. And the QR code will take you to a site that looks like that. You can enter in the number there if you want, or as often it's just easy to click on the code. And the first question that we want to get you to respond to is, in your day-to-day world, in your world where you work, live and play, what does perpetration of gender-based violence mean? This also helps Lula and Michael, I guess, get a sense of who's on the line and what that means. You don't have to do this if you don't want to. I can see there's a few participants checking now. There'll be a second question in a minute. But I think if we can kind of get a sense of where we're at. Now, this is the locating in the space as well. Exerting unhealthy power and control over others. Yep. And knowing who is performing the act of violence. Someone who believes, so there's the attitudinal, so the perpetration based on the attitudes and the thoughts you carry. Control of women thinking twice about going for a run alone. Yeah, and look, in Victoria, that sense of can you run safely, I think is something that's in the minds. Yep, men. And I'm noticing here that some of these statements identify sex and gender, and some of them don't. Some of them are identifying that it's all types of violence. Entitlement being uncontrolled. How it can be prevented. Thank you. Really rich, folks. Thank you so much. I can see some more participants going. The next question that we've got is sort of about the application of it, or a bit more about understanding. So I can see people writing in here. And I might just, forgive me, go to the next one. That's okay. You can see the little number running at the top. That's what I'm stressing about. There we go. We'll go to the next one. So let's go. Well, if that's what your understanding of perpetration, what ways can primary prevention directly impact perpetration? And probably for us at WHISE, that's the new bit. That's the bit we're interested. Not the response, but how do we stop? How do we prevent perpetration? While that's underway, I'm going to turn our attention to our colleagues Lula and Michael and start to introduce them. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to Lula Dembele and Michael Flood. Look, our invitation out to colleagues to attend gave the bio of Lula and Michael. I think what I'd like to do is, rather than just read that, is sort of talk to you about what the work of Lula and Michael means to us at WHISE. Lula and Michael are constantly encouraging the practice that we do, keeping us energized and aligned, and when we fatigue, reconnecting to us about why we're doing what we're doing, but also providing that support freely and democratically on the information and the capacity and the opportunities to collaborate. Michael is prolific in his work and research, and for those of you who don't know, runs a wonderful website called XY Online, where so much of his work is given freely, and he also curates work as well. For those of us that are not used to reading academic papers every day, it's incredibly helpful. I think for us, for Lula, I know Lula used to work at WHISE, but is constantly coaching to make sure that we are forwarding and advancing our practice and the work that we do. Lula has shared her lived experience as a way to create social change. Together they have been at the forefront of some of the most significant pieces of work. For instance, most recently, the research around the Men's Project with Jesuit Social Services. I'm not going to say anything more except to follow them on the socials and keep up to date with what they're doing. I think Lula and Michael, you can see what's coming through, perhaps the Slido on what the prevention strategies might be. But without further ado, I would love to hand over to both of you.
Well, thank you, Kit, for that very warm and kind introduction. This is an interesting setting for Michael and I. We'll just note we are sitting next to each other, but we're trying to make that less complicated by, in our presentation, speaking directly to you. So apologies if that does throw you off, and we are interacting, which is an interesting new environment for us as well, presenting like this. So excuse us while we get through that, and hopefully it's not distracting. But Kitty, are we ready to go to?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thanks everyone for your engagement. I've been reading the comments, and that helps prompt some of our thinking and certainly open up the discussion for today. I really liked the empathy for men but not excuses comment that someone made in the chat there. But I'm just going to get straight into it. We have limited time, so I will use it hopefully effectively. So as you can see on screen, many of the cornerstone statistical statements relating to sexual, domestic and family violence take what can be understood as a gender-sensitive approach. They recognise the gendered nature of these types of violence, but predominantly by recognising the gender of the victim. For example, one woman is killed every 9 days by a partner. On average, 8 Australian women are hospitalised every day after being assaulted by their spouse or partner. 1 in 6 Australian women are physically and or sexually abused before the age of 15. 1 in 3 women worldwide have experienced physical and or sexual violence by an intimate partner or non-partner sexual violence. And for Australian women aged 25 to 44, family, domestic and sexual violence causes more illness, disability and premature death than any other risk factor. So naturally, when we hear these statistics, we think about women's safety, the impact on women's lives and women's systematic vulnerability to these types of abuse. But what I'm here to say to you today is that while violence is a problem for victims, it is not a victim's problem. Let me offer you some perspectives on why not naming who is using violence and framing sexual, domestic and family violence as a women's issue through that female-centric victim lens is problematic. 1, it obscures the role of male actors and men's use of violence. 2, it minimises personal and societal accountability for the behaviour and its prevalence. 3, it reinforces gender stereotypes of women needing protection instead of men being responsible for and changing their violent behaviour. It perpetuates victim blaming by centralising female victims as the subject of sexual, domestic and family violence, leading to those questions of, was she drunk? What was she wearing? Why didn't she leave? It reinforces heteronormative understandings of intimate relationships. It conceals male victims' experiences, and it only addresses violence after the harm has been done. For while we must recognise the disproportionate impact on women's lives and continue to support and empower women, only addressing the victims does not stop the perpetration of violence or from abuse and violence occurring. If we want to stop, reduce and eliminate violence, we need to discuss who is using violence and why. So we must be looking at who is using violence in order to prevent it. That feels like a pretty obvious thing to say. Unfortunately, that's not always where we get to in these conversations. Leaving our prevention efforts to looking for signs of victimisation really burdens victims with the responsibility to leave or seek help if they are being abused. And that is a response to violence. It is not prevention in its most fundamental terms. While attempting to stop recidivism can be understood as a form of prevention, it's really tertiary prevention. And we are here today to focus on primary prevention and probably look at a bit of early intervention or secondary prevention as well. This shift in focus is critical for a couple of reasons that our report, Who Uses Domestic, Family and Sexual Violence, How and Why, highlights. One, less than 2% of people who use domestic, family and sexual violence will ever come into contact with the legal system. And this is where we systematically situate our interventions to stop abuse or repeat behaviours of violence. So this is clearly not going to make a change at a population level to reduce violence if it's less than 2% of people using violence. And two, the trajectories of violence of perpetration are fairly stable. So once someone commences using controlling, abusive or violent behaviours, they are unlikely to stop without a deliberate and intensive intervention. And although there is although in general, there is some evidence that physical violence perpetration does reduce with age. So one of the challenges that we have to date is we do not have many proven models of what works to stop and reduce people's use of DFSV. And we are delivering those interventions at scale to address the problem of perpetration in Australia. Part of why we cannot deliver appropriate interventions at scale or target groups of people who are higher at risk of commencing the use of domestic, family and sexual violence is because in Australia, we do not have national data sets on domestic, family and sexual violence perpetration. We had a question in preparing for this webinar today from Grace, which asked, what are the most up-to-date statistics on men's perpetration of violence? For example, 94% of men and 95% of all women who experience violence, the violence was perpetrated by a man, and that's a statistics we see from our watch. So to answer that, Australia collects regular data on people's attitudes towards violence against women, the National Community Attitudes Towards Violence Against Women Survey, or NCAS, which is run by ANROS. And we also capture data on domestic, family and sexual violence victimisation through the Personal Safety Survey, which the Australian Bureau of Statistics runs, I think, every 4 years. But we do not measure the behaviours of domestic, family and sexual violence perpetration and who is using domestic, family and sexual violence at a local, state or national level. This means that while we can say 95% of women who experience violence said the perpetrator was a man, this does not tell us how many men or people use and perpetrate the behaviours of DFSV. To me, obviously, this is a glaring knowledge gap. And from my opening points, you can see that only collecting victimisation data actually skews what we think the problem is, changes our responses to only acting after harm is done, and burdens victims with the responsibility to try and stop it. This is why since 2018, myself, along with Michael and the Equality Institute, have been working towards getting the first national study on perpetration of domestic, family and sexual violence done in Australia. This will give us the opportunity to focus our national efforts towards understanding perpetration of domestic, family and sexual violence as the problem that we are trying to resolve. To flip it a little bit, I will acknowledge that the good news here is that trajectory of non-violence is also quite stable. And what this means for practice is that if we deliberately encourage non-violence and identify and disrupt the pathways into perpetration, then we can make a really meaningful impact in the prevention work to end violence against women. Over to you.
Thanks, Lula. And you may have been looking at the slides and noticing something about those slides, noticing all these pictures of sometimes smiling men and other men and so on. And while we're not going to say much about those men themselves, really it's an expression of our effort, an effort that Lula has pioneered since 2018 at least, to put perpetrators in the picture. And so, as you may have figured out, these are pictures of men who've used domestic, family and sexual violence. And in terms of what we'll do today, some of what we're doing today is summarising work we've done. So the State of Knowledge Report on Violence Perpetration, thank you, Kit, for that shout out. It was co-authored by myself, Lula, Kirsty Mills and Che Brown, who was at the Equality Institute at the time. And the full report is available from the resources list at the end of this presentation. There's also an 800-word summary if the full report's too daunting. But I wanted to say that some of the work we'll do today is new. It's not work we've done. And I wanted to thank Kit and WHISE for really inviting Lula and I to try to think through what the knowledge on perpetration that report involves, what that means for primary prevention. So some of this work is old, some of this work feels very new and more tentative. So to say a bit about perpetration, domestic, family and sexual violence have their roots in factors at multiple levels of society, including at the individual level, the relationship level, the community level. So if we think about, why is it that some people, some men, indeed some women, use violence, use domestic and family and sexual violence? One reason is they've learnt. They've learnt that behaving in abusive ways is normal or acceptable. They've come to believe that behaviour is expected in their social circles or settings, or they've become personally invested in domination and control over their partners or others. Some people's use of violence is shaped by their own exposure to violence as children. It's shaped their social learning, what they see as acceptable. It's also shaped their psychological and emotional development. Some people have grown up in communities and contexts that normalise the use of coercion or abuse as part of sexuality or relationships. And some people's use of violence is enabled by wider gender inequalities and other social inequalities, inequalities in divisions of labour, in access to work, in access to money and power and so on. So in short, perpetration, the use of violence, is driven by risk factors at the individual, relationship and community levels. And if we look at the research, and we did summarise this research in that State of Knowledge report, there are a series of factors that are consistently identified as risk factors for perpetration. One is the features of neighbourhoods or communities or cultures, particularly gender inequitable structures and norms. We know that there are higher levels of violence against women, for example, in communities and countries that have greater levels of gender inequality. Violent supportive settings and contexts are another risk factor. Situational variables such as separation. If a woman is living with violence already by her male partner and then leaves that relationship, we know that the risk of violence, including homicide, escalates on and around that time. Firearm availability is another situational variable. We know that having sexist and violent supportive peers is a risk factor. If you're a young man, for example, who's surrounded by other young men who think it's okay to push up against a woman's resistance to see how far you can get and so on, you are more likely to behave in sexually coercive ways yourself. We know that at the individual level, having violent, supportive and hostile masculine attitudes is a factor. We know that witnessing or experiencing childhood violence is a factor, although we shouldn't assume it's inevitable or deterministic. I should say, however, there's a whole lot we don't know. We don't know a lot about the risk factors for perpetration of some forms of violence, such as sexual harassment, for example. We don't know a lot about the respective influence or interaction of different risk and protective factors at different levels of society. We know much more about male perpetrators of violence and far less about female perpetrators of violence and far less about same-sex perpetrators. Next slide, please. So to think about trajectories, to think about boys and young men, we know that people's use of violence, particularly boys and men's use of violence, starts young. So, for example, substantial proportions of adolescents, anywhere from kind of 10 to 20 to 30%, perpetrate dating violence against their partners or ex-partners, at least some forms of physical aggression or psychological or verbal aggression. We know that perpetrators of sexual violence, particularly male perpetrators, start young. From research over time, looking at young adult male perpetrators of rape and sexual assault, the average age of first perpetration of sexual violence among those boys and young men was 16. So if you, if you find young men, for example, who are being sexually violent, who are committing rape and sexual assault in their early 20s, most of them began doing so around 16. And we know that most people who commit sexual coercion as young adults will continue to do so, especially if they avoid criminal detection or sanction. There is some diversity in the trajectories of perpetration, but many young people's patterns of either non-violence or violence persist over time. And so, given that most sexual violence perpetration, for example, starts young, we have to start young as well. We have to address sexual coercion and its risk factors early in young people's lives. Now, an obvious strategy there is respectful relationships education. A complementary strategy is comprehensive sexuality education. And we know that children and young people who've gone through robust, comprehensive sexuality education are less likely to perpetrate or to suffer sexual violence than other young people. And there are other interventions we need as well for those at risk of or already using violence. And we will come back to that later today. Next slide, please. There's also diversity. There's considerable diversity among perpetrators. So, for example, there's been really interesting Australian research among the men who use domestic and family violence against their adult female partners. Now, some of those men are what you might think of as generalists. They're involved in various forms of violent and criminal behaviour. So they're being violent to their partners, but they're also using violence against others and involved in various other forms of crime. Other men are involved in partner-only violence. They're what some people call specialists, although some people dislike the term. But their pattern of violence is quite different. It's focused only on their partners. Another difference is to do with different patterns of violence, different dynamics of violence. Now, many domestic violence advocates will tell you that domestic violence is defined by a systematic pattern of power and control. And increasingly, we use the phrase coercive control for a situation where one partner is using violence or a combination of other controlling and coercive tactics to dominate and coerce their partner. And those patterns of violence are different from what some research calls common couple violence or situational couple violence, where there's occasional minor violence, much lower levels of physical aggression. The violence tends not to escalate, tends not to cause injury or fear, and above all, is not accompanied by a broader pattern of coercive control. Now, I'm not saying that that pattern is okay, it's acceptable, we should turn a blind eye to it. I'm not saying any of that. But in our responses to perpetrators and victims and so on, we do need to acknowledge the different forms that violence can take. Just to end on this point about diversity, there's also diversity in what drives people's use of violence. There's evidence that, for example, the risk factors for male perpetrators differ from those for female perpetrators. So, for example, we look at sexual violence perpetration. Most sexual violence perpetration is by men overwhelmingly, but a small proportion is by women. And if we look at risk factors, prior sexual abuse is a shared risk factor among male and female perpetrators of sexual violence. But for men, other key predictors include sexual dominance, a kind of desire to dominate women sexually, and what you can call sociosexuality, a preference for impersonal, casual sex. But among women, they're not predictors. Among women, a key predictor of sexual coercion is sexual compulsivity, a sense of not being in control, a kind of lack of control of your sexual behaviour. If we look at intimate partner violence in same-sex relationships, there's again some distinct drivers. So, for example, among gay men and lesbians, a predictor of domestic violence perpetration is internalized homophobia, having taken on kind of broader cultural hostility and negative beliefs about gay men and lesbians and so on. So there's diversity. There's also co-occurrence and overlap. So, for example, we know that the men who perpetrate sexual harassment at work are also more likely to perpetrate sexual assault, other forms of sexual coercion. We know that if a household has intimate partner violence, it's also more likely to have child maltreatment, to have child violence and so on. And in fact, the risk factors for these different forms of violence also overlap. At the community level, for example, you get higher levels of violence against women and higher levels of violence against children, where you've got violent supportive social norms, weak legal sanctions, male dominance, high levels of inequality, and high levels of community violence. So where you've got a community characterised by those features, then you get high levels of a variety of forms of violence, including men's violence against women and violence against children. I'll hand back to Lula.
Next slide, please.
Next, yeah, great.
So, we're going to have a discussion now a bit about how we think about perpetrators. And this was an incredible quote, which I think got straight to the point. In considering perpetrators, it is wise to avoid either or thinking, either they are monsters or they are damaged human beings. Either they are individually responsible or this is a social problem. Either practitioners provide treatment or they engage in the criminal justice system. Either the focus is on addressing the underlying factors that fuel perpetration or on educating our communities about safety. For the Accountability Matters project, which I established in 2018, next slide, we have 3 lines of effort to reframe perpetration as the problem we're trying to resolve to achieve social change. The third of these lines of effort asks us to transform the ways in which we are willing to see and represent people who use domestic, family, and sexual violence. We need to shift our responses from the good versus bad construct to understanding that it is people we already know, people we like, and people we love who are capable of abuse and violence. I would challenge our current zero tolerance approaches that portray men as either good for not using violence or bad if they do. The media is criticised for portraying men accused of rape and murder as monsters or demonising all men. In the context of domestic family violence, this often does not reflect the victim's experience of knowing the whole person who is perpetrating the violence. It may be their father, a friend, a caregiver, a trusted adult, or a partner. In these types of relationships, victims often express a desire for that violence, but not necessarily the relationship to end. The monsters trope contributes to people's sense of shame, or for victims that they will not be believed because their perpetrator does not come across this way, and it reduces willingness to come forward or to report. Hence, the monster trope keeps these types of abuse hidden. Conversely, the media is also criticised for reporting on men accused of violence as the guy next door, the good bloke, or the person nobody would have ever suspected. And while it may feel wrong, and many rightfully want accountability for the behaviour represented in media reporting as best practice guidelines, please see our Watch Media guidelines on that. The reality check is that this is how perpetrators of domestic, family, and sexual violence are most often seen by the public, by their friends, by colleagues, and to the community. They are the friend. They are the person they share a coffee with. They are the person they go out for drinks with. They are the person living next door. Next slide. Similarly, when it comes to understanding who are victims and who are perpetrators of violence, while I am explicitly asking that we orient towards looking at perpetration, and that again, we know from women's victimisation data, it is overwhelmingly perpetrated by men. At the same time, boys and men are the majority of victims of all male violence. Boys are approximately 50% of the children experiencing men's use of domestic and family violence in the home. And as the Australian Institute of Criminology documented, men accounted for around 5 in 6 domestic violence offenders recorded by police. Often, the same man has been both victim and perpetrator. So this isn't a zero-sum game. Based on what we do know about perpetrators, mostly from victim survivors, is that the majority of people who use domestic, family, and sexual violence are neither complete monsters, nor are they the good blokes incapable of ever hurting anyone. We need to recognise that the reality is it's people we already know, people we like, and people we love who are capable of harming women and children and those they care about the most. Based on the rates of victimisation in Australia, the people using domestic, family, and sexual violence right now are statistically in your family, in your circle of friends, at your workplace, live on your street, and participate in your community. We need to sit in that discomfort and challenge our reactions of black and white thinking of good or bad men, innocent or guilty, victim or perpetrator. We can and must condemn their harmful behaviours. But to dismiss them as bad people or monsters only keeps the people who use domestic, family and sexual violence hidden in plain sight, because we are misleading ourselves and the community by not acknowledging who they are in totality. Someone's son, maybe your favourite uncle, the revered coach, your partner's best friend, your colleague you chat to while having your regular coffee at work. We need to go beyond the judgment of a person and reorient to looking for and understanding the behaviours that are harmful and why people use them. We need to learn how to identify, prevent, and/or reduce them before they are a habit or a way of operating for any one individual or a group of people. And we need to believe that people can change, but know that this is exceptionally unlikely to happen without systemic encouragement, a culture of accountability, and external interventions. So where do we begin? We must view the problem of violence not only by how it impacts victims, but who uses violence if we want to achieve change, if we want to stop women being murdered, and if we want to see the atrocious rates of sexual violence actually start to decrease. The dominant discourse portraying women as victims, at risk, vulnerable, and in need of protection, and generalising men as violent perpetrators does not change the power dynamics of gender relations. In fact, it may reinforce inequalities by playing up to gender stereotypes, which the evidence has shown is one of the key drivers of violence against women. What we need now are transformative approaches that challenge the status quo of gendered violence, including by having an accountability lens and naming who is using domestic, family and sexual violence. We had another question from the participant Fiona, who asked, what tips do you have for data gurus in converting the statistical language from victim survivors to perpetrators? And I'm very glad you asked that question, Fiona. A few years ago, I did this work, and you must forgive me, it was my first go on Canva. I was brand new, I'd never done anything like this before. So it's not the tiniest, neatest work, and it's detailed, not the easiest to consume. However, until we have such time that we have a national study on perpetration of domestic, family and sexual violence that is supported and being done at scale at regular intervals, what we can learn or reshape from the current data is a focus on perpetration in how we present those statistics. I'll let you read those if you can see them properly, but essentially they take the focus of the victim-centric lens, and where they have identified that there is a male or female perpetrator, it flips that and centralizes the actor who is using violence as what we focus on in that statistic, at the same time as looking at who has been impacted by that violence. It does both, and we need both. We need to know who is using violence, who they target, and what the impacts are in our statistics to share that understanding of what domestic, family and sexual violence is and where we need to look to stop it. I would put it out to any statisticians in the session today to have the time to look and who may wish to work on ensuring that these interpretations are still accurate. But I do hope that what they demonstrate is that it is possible right now, as it was indeed 5 years ago when I did these, to change our descriptive narrative and how we use the data so that we can focus on who is using DFSV and accountability for its perpetration. Back to Michael.
Thank you. Next slide. So look, let's move now to focusing or to sort of reminding you of what prevention is. And I'm sure everyone in this call can kind of say this, that prevention is about, primary prevention is about efforts to prevent violence from occurring in the first place. Even that language I'm increasingly conscious of, because it does imply, violence just occurs. It's something that happens to women, to men, to others, rather than something that is done to them. But certainly we'd agree that we have to respond well to victim survivors, we have to hold perpetrators accountable, and we have to work to prevent that violence from occurring in the first place, to prevent people from using violence in the first place. So in terms of what prevention means, I think there's growing awareness in Australia that primary prevention is not only about changing people's attitudes, is not simply about addressing individuals and their behaviour. Instead, it's about changing the social conditions that support and promote violence against women, children, and others. It's about preventing initial perpetration and victimisation by changing the social conditions that enable them, that make them possible. And it's oriented to addressing the drivers of, the risk factors for, the determinants of various forms of violence, domestic, family, and sexual violence, particularly gender drivers. And I think our watch, in its Change the Story framework and elsewhere, deserves credit for its consistent emphasis on the need to change structures, norms, and practices to work at that level of social change. And there's really, sorry, next slide, please. There's a compelling rationale in terms of focusing on men's violence against women for a moment. There's compelling rationale for engaging men and boys. So if we are to prevent and reduce domestic and sexual violence, well, obviously, we have to change the behaviour of those men, that minority of men who use violence. Second, though, we have to change the behaviour of those men around them, the men who condone or are complicit in other men's violence. More broadly, though, we have to change the social conditions among men and women and others in general, which allow that violence to continue. So prevention efforts should engage men and boys to lessen their likelihood of perpetration, to harness their positive influence on other boys and men, and to address key drivers of violence. Drivers, for example, to do with male sexual entitlement, male peer support, sexist masculine cultures, and so on. And the point I think it's crucial to make is that perpetrators are made, not born. Little boy babies don't come into the world with an innate orientation towards using violence against women and girls and others. Instead, it's how they are raised, how they are socialised, the social conditions into which they live, in which they're born, that make some boys and men into perpetrators. So think, for example, of the husbands and male partners who've been putting about 13 women a day into hospital by assaulting them. Think of the men who sexually assaulted the 145,000 women who were sexually assaulted at least once in the last 12 months. Think of the men who sexually harassed the 1.25 million women who were sexually harassed at least once in the last year. These men don't come out of thin air. Their violence is a social product. It's the entirely predictable outcome of widespread social conditions, of common lessons about masculinity or manhood. It's the outcome of sexist peer cultures. It's the outcome of gender inequalities, which are woven into men's and women's and other people's lives. It's shaped by other conditions too, by poverty and disadvantage, by alcohol and drug use and so on. But it is shaped above all by gender drivers, by gender norms, gender stereotypes, and gender inequalities. So if we want to stop making perpetrators, we have to change the social conditions and settings that produce them. And part of what I'm doing here feels like going back to early radical feminism, actually, to early second wave radical feminism, and its emphasis on the need to address the social and structural forces and relations that produce the violence that some men, a minority of men, perpetrate. Think of that phrase, rape culture. Rape culture is an early feminist phrase for the kind of social and cultural norms in society that make sexual coercion seem legitimate, seem acceptable, seem sexy. And that feminist insight about the need to address structural and social gender inequalities, I think, has to be at the heart of prevention work. Next slide, please. And so in terms of what this actually means, and this is some of the new thinking we've been doing, it does mean that in general, in our work, we need to focus more on preventing perpetration, not only on responding to victimisation, because if that's all we do, as Lula has very articulately emphasised, if all we do is respond to victim survivors, we are putting the burden of prevention on them. Instead, we need to focus more on preventing perpetration. And that means, of course, addressing key drivers of perpetration. That means intervening in those aspects of masculinity that feed into the violence that some men perpetrate. And I don't mean just at the individual level. I mean at the level of society and culture and social norms. So in the field of sexual violence, for example, when it comes to sexual violence, one very consistent predictor of using sexual violence among men is if they agree with, if they support what's called hostile masculinity. And hostile masculinity involves sexual dominance, having sexual motives and a sense of sexual pleasure tied to having power over your sexual partner. A second thing it involves is hostility towards women, having antagonistic or distrustful attitudes towards women. A third thing it involves is the belief that male-female relationships are inherently exploitative or manipulative. A fourth thing it involves is acceptance of rape myths, of rape-supportive beliefs, of stereotypical beliefs about rape. And the final thing that hostile masculinity involves is acceptance of interpersonal violence, the belief that force is a legitimate way to gain compliance in sexual relationships. And frankly, you know, I'm practically reading off here the kind of playbook that people like Andrew Tate and other misogynist social influencers offer, and the kind of responses you get on Twitter whenever you post about sexual assault, as I was doing yesterday. You know, I've seen people offering precisely these beliefs, men offering precisely these beliefs, as far as I can tell, essentially outing themselves as rapists or potential rapists. We also have to address key drivers of perpetration, not just at the individual and relationship levels, but at the institutional, community, and societal levels. We need to change social norms, and I'm frustrated that in Australia so far, we have yet to see much kind of large-scale social norms campaigns trying to shift some common masculine norms that feed into violence. One, for example, is the notion of male sexual entitlement, the notion that men are owed sex, that women owe men sex and access to their bodies. That feeds into sexual violence, and we need thoroughgoing social norms campaigns addressing that. We also need regulatory and technological strategies addressing porn, because much porn shows violence and much porn feeds into sexual violence. We also need structural strategies aimed at shifting the economic and the material power relations among men and women. We need strategies that address men's economic control and women's economic dependency, strategies about fair wages, about women's employment, about domestic and caring work, and so on. And I know that Lula has been involved in some important work addressing financial abuse, addressing forms of perpetration that are coming to increasing public attention, working with banks and others. And again, that's a piece of this work. And it has to work at the institutional and societal level, not just at the small scale level. Next slide, please. So there's this lovely kind of iceberg graphic, which was generated, I think, by Gippsland Women's Health. And it really speaks to the way that the behaviours that are above the water, the behaviours we can see, murder, rape and sexual abuse, physical and sexual abuse, they rest on a foundation of broader gender inequalities, of everyday patterns of sexism, sexist jokes and comments, of other forms of material and social inequality among men and women. And as Lula has pointed out, we need to intervene below the waterline. We need to address the roots of those forms of violence. And a piece of this work is the need to focus more on addressing potential or actual perpetrators. We have to recognise that perpetration is actually common. So, for example, a US meta-analysis of studies among university students found that 27% of male university students had perpetrated sexual violence. So 1 in 4. We can't keep thinking it's, 1 in 1,000. It's more likely to be 1 in 10 or 1 in 4, depending on the behaviour. We have to teach skills in not being a perpetrator. We have to actively teach boys and men, girls and women and others how to engage respectfully with others, how to resolve conflicts well, how to establish consent, and so on. And of course, we have to hold actual perpetrators themselves accountable. We have to address the individuals at risk of perpetration, the men, the women and others whose own behaviour, whose own histories shows a heightened risk of perpetration. So, for example, that may mean addressing the boys and young men who are part of peer groups or college fraternities or sporting groups with higher levels of sexist and violence supportive beliefs. It may mean addressing the boys and men who are engaged in high-risk drinking because their use of drinking can be a way to excuse their violence or to make potential victims more vulnerable, and so on. We also have to address pathways into perpetration, and that will involve some smart thinking around how to address childhood exposure to domestic and family violence, and people's experiences of trauma, of mental ill health, and so on. Last point I want to make is on the next slide, and it's about addressing perpetrators' tactics themselves. Our work in perpetration needs to be informed by our knowledge of how perpetrators behave, perpetrators' MO or modus operandi, because perpetrators will take certain actions to make it more likely that they can commit their crime, such as selecting or grooming a victim. They will then perpetrate that crime, and then they'll also work to minimize the chances that the crime will be disclosed or discovered. And for example, a man who's interested in perpetrating sexual violence against a female friend or against a woman who seems very drunk at a pub, or a woman at a party, and so on, he will think about the costs and benefits of that action. And if he successfully completes that assault and gets away with it, he's more likely to do it again. And each time he does so, he will improve his MO to increase the likelihood of completing his crime while minimizing the chances of his detection. And he may change his MO over time as new opportunities present themselves or as contextual factors change. For example, if there's greater supervision or greater oversight of a set of victims or a circumstance where he'd been sexually violent before, he may then look elsewhere. So this is very blunt about the way that perpetrators act rationally and will choose and groom and improve their own strategies of perpetration. So we need to address perpetrators' typical tactics. We need to intervene early with offenders and often, and we have to address the situations and settings themselves that involve greater opportunities for perpetration. Next slide, and back to Lula.
So I am just conscious of time. We have come to the end of our time session, but I did just write out some points, which I won't go into depth here, for reflection and discussion about, well, what can we do right now? What are the things we can start to do right now? For one, I am definitely going to repeat my call for a national study on who uses domestic, family, and social violence, how and why, so that we can better understand this picture and the various pathways into perpetration. I think we need to grapple with the connections between victimisation and perpetration without falling into the trap of justifying abuse and use of violence because someone has experienced victimisation. This isn't necessarily strictly primary prevention, but I do think understanding particularly childhood recovery from domestic, family and sexual violence is a critical intervention to stop intergenerational cycles of violence. And we can do that through a number of ways at scale, through trauma recovery, teaching emotional literacy, teaching nonviolent communication, and helping people with self-regulation. And that's where perhaps we start to look at the co-occurrence with mental health disorders and behaviour regulation in the context of mental health as well. We have to regulate the pornography industry and limit underage access, and the government needs to have done that already. Sadly, they are not acting on that as fast as they should and could, and they absolutely can right now. And the next thing I want to point out is that medically, there is absolutely no safe way to choke or strangle someone. I am not here to kink shame anyone or make anyone feel bad about sexuality. I am very, this sounds weird, I'm very pro-sex, very happy about sex, very happy to speak about female sexuality and female pleasure. This is all critical part of the conversation, but you cannot choke someone safely. And while I absolutely do not want to be making anyone feel uncomfortable about their own sexual choices, I absolutely want to stand up with and empower those young women who at the moment are being shamed for being vanilla and being coerced and forced into sexual violent practices that they do not want, that can have the life-threatening impact that they may not see now, but may cause an embolism in their brain in 10, 20 years to come. So it is very serious. And I think as a primary prevention sector, we have some work to do about how we discuss that and basically just state it plainly. There is no safe way to choke. So I'm going to, Michael can talk more broadly to pornography as he did, but we'll open up now for conversation.
Thank you so much, Lula and Michael, for that incredible, I guess, generous sharing of your experience and your research. Colleagues, we will send out the slides after this, and we absolutely will share. Lula's very generously said those tiles that I think are quite lovely. I think you've nailed the Canva there, Lula. Lula has actually emailed them to us just then, so we will make sure that they are out there as well. Colleagues, we will go for a break, but I do want to give us a moment before we have a break and then come back and we'll go into breakout sessions. Just to go through a bit of a Q&A, if that's all right. Just everyone, Danny's just sharing also in the chat the links to the sources that Lula and Michael are quoting. All right.
There is one question.
Yes, thanks, Nat. Thank you so much, Danny. Do you want to, is that from Natalie? Yep.
From Natalie, I'm curious about disability and neurodivergence prevalence or overlooked diagnosis in those who perpetrate. I'm also very curious about the role of racism and colorism that plays in perpetration.
Oh yeah, sorry, that was meant to be colorism.
Thank you.
Sorry, Nat.
So Lula and Michael, the piece there is about the idea about neurodiversity and disability in perpetration and the role of those other intersectional barriers. Michael or Lula, I don't know. Michael, I can see you've got your mute off already.
Yeah, I'll jump in.
Oh yeah, sure.
Just we're not doing two sounds or we'd kill everyone's.
That's right.
So on the first bit about neurodivergence and disability, we know that in the victimisation statistics, obviously, particularly women with disabilities experience much higher rates of these forms of violence. When it comes to perpetration, again, there's a lot we don't know. One thing we do know is that acquired brain injury has a relationship with behavioural regulation and violence. And I think there is some work to do here when we're looking at particular mental health disorders that do skew someone's ability to regulate their behaviour, to understand their behaviour, if it is compulsive, impulsive behaviours that tend towards violence. I think we need to understand what the relationship is there. I wouldn't say that it's a driver though, because again, it's like you have people with those conditions who don't choose to use sexual domestic family violence, and then you have people who may express it that way as well. So we need to understand what the extra level is there. When it comes to, what's the second part of that, colorism and
racism, so the intersecting barriers,
yeah. Look, one of the things that we really want to achieve with the national study on the perpetration of domestic family and sexual violence is who perpetrators target. That's why we need that full picture. And again, from victimisation statistics, obviously we know that First Nations women experience higher rates of violence, and there's, again, greater rates of victimisation and experience of violence for migrant women, and the culturally and racially marginalised communities are targeted for being culturally and racially marginalised. So I think we really need to unpack what the motivations are, why someone may choose to use violence against a particular person. My hypotheses would be that, coming back to how perpetrators perpetrate, they perpetrate against people they think they'll get away with it. So if we have a culture that is dismissive, dehumanizing, degrading of particular groups of people, then they're an easy target.
Can I comment too? Just in terms of racism and perpetration, three points to make. One is that Australia's history of colonisation has a profound impact on, obviously on Indigenous communities, and therefore plays out levels of poverty, of mental ill health, of drug abuse and so on, play out in part in Indigenous men's perpetration against Indigenous women and others. And I think, it's important to acknowledge that. And there's two other things it's important to say as well. One is that statistics on this are skewed, and data on this is skewed in part by the over-policing of Indigenous communities and the kind of heightened attention that police typically will give, and the heightened action that police will take in response to Indigenous and ethnic minority offenders over other perpetrators. So to put it bluntly, if I assault a woman, I'm far less likely as a white man to be arrested and charged than an Indigenous man perpetrating the same violence. And yeah, so we also have to sort of be aware of some of the complexities around police action and data themselves.
Yeah, and administrative data and
Yeah.
generally how that is collected in our report, it does recognise that the systems themselves have racial biases, and therefore we talk about the prevalence of violence in particular communities, because those communities have been targeted for research. Who's doing the general population? How many Anglo-Saxon men, white Australian men are perpetrating these forms of violence? I'm yet to see that study.
Yeah. Lula and Michael, thank you so much. I'm conscious of time too. And I think what you're just saying in response to those questions really just reinforces the core central arguments, which is we need to understand perpetration more. We need to move away from this good versus bad, the binary, as it were, again, to understand it as well. Colleagues, really want to give you a break for about, we'll say 10 minutes. So come back at, say, oh, less than 10 minutes. Let's come back at, say, just before 1:45. And we're going to go and ask you to go into breakout rooms to really just answer a few simple questions, which is, what did you hear? But what do you think it means for primary prevention activities? We'll do a debrief, and then we'll do another session with some quick fire kind of solutions before we end. So everyone take a break, step away from that computer, go make a cup of tea or get a drink, and we'll see you just before 1:45 where we will kick off again. Turn your screens off, walk away, and we'll see you soon. Thanks, mate. Thank you. So we just want to kind of debrief now, break you into breakout rooms on 3 key questions. And really, they're just structured to let you reflect upon it. And what we've got for each of those breakout rooms is you'll see Danny and me nick into each of the breakout rooms, and we're going to share with you a Google link that'll just be a worksheet if you'd like to capture some of your thoughts under each of those questions. So the first thing we want to know is, what spoke to you? What did you take away? There was so much in there. And I know that there was a great comment, I think it was from Fiona, which was, take that, Elon Musk, put that on your Twitter account. But then what does it mean to primary prevention? And Michael and Lewis spoke through what they thought the implications of that was, right? Really helpfully. But then let's do the application thing. What does it mean when we walk out of this session or we go into the space tomorrow to continue doing our work? When we next develop the campaign, how might we change what we do? We've probably got something, a project in our minds at the moment. What do we think we might do to adapt it? So those are the questions. We've got 45 minutes before we finish. We're going to give you about 15 minutes in these breakout rooms, and then we're going to bring you back, and we're going to ask you to possibly, if anyone wants to share what emerged. And then we're going to ask you to go back in, and we're just going to do a very quick set of ideas over the short, medium, long term, because there's nothing as practical as a good theory. So let's make it into practice. Okay. All right. And with that, I will open all the rooms. And so you should see a little thing in front of you to meet. And you'll also, Danny and I will nick in between each of the rooms and share with the group your link to your Google. So we'll see you soon. Please start by introducing yourselves. Okay, folks. I'm hoping that you hopefully know WHISE well enough to know that this won't be the only time that we have this conversation, that clearly we are, starting to build our thinking and our work in our region with this work. But having said that, let's just take a moment to debrief. And really what I want to do with this moment, if I can, is just offer people the opportunity, whoever feels comfortable, don't want to do forced family fun, as it were, to just share maybe, your answer to, let's go to this slide, the first question. From your discussions, what were the key things that were heard, that were took away, that resonated? I can see we've got some comments emerging in those wonderful notes. They're quite packed, but was there anything that anyone wanted to share from your discussions? Raise your hand. Fiona Cost. Wonderful. Your voice.
Oh, look, with that first question, one from our group that I think was really, really important is around that violence doesn't happen in a vacuum, that it's so much bigger than that, than just the individual behaviour. But there is so much more going on in an individual's life, in the community life, in policy, in everything. And so, yeah, so many different drivers that impact it. And, you know, it's not a blame game either. You know, it's not an us versus them. It's a we have to work together, all genders, to be able to change it and stuff. So, yeah, there's not good and bad people, those sorts of
And in that way, it's quite liberating, isn't it, from that perspective, isn't it? When you think of the day-to-day work of primary prevention, that's quite a liberating thing to be given permission that way.
Yeah. And it means you can speak to everybody about the issue in a warm way, and a way that invites people into the solution rather than blocking people out of it.
Yeah, it's more in keeping with the way we want to work too, isn't it, Fiona?
Yep.
Anyone else want to comment on question 1, or maybe even just go to point 2? WHG dead. Do you want to make a comment, my friend?
I've been given the job of talking about what we found in our group.
Yeah, sure. Whichever question you want to respond to, please.
I'm going to go with, it's a bit noisy in here today, but
you're right.
What did we take away from Lula and Michael, and what resonated? So many things. The explanation of media presenting men following incidents, the problematic framing as being the good person and contextualizes perpetrators as being anyone. How interesting that is, because I think that, again, can only be helpful in terms of people recognising the prevalence of the problem and the idea of that monster trope not being the case. Perpetrators are made and not born, which I thought was amazing. I especially, and I think all of us, really looked at the reframing of statistics and the onus on the perpetrator and victims, and that's something that I will use tomorrow.
Yay!
I love that. I love that. Calling out perpetrators and showing their photos, and I think one of the things that's happened is, you know, we've often talked about let's not show their faces and let's not use their name, but how powerful that was in that presentation. And again, I think that's been a real rethink. Someone had talked about the preciseness of Lulu saying that FSV is a problem, but it's not the victim's problem, which was just so brilliantly articulated. Conversation about targeting perpetrators that can't take accountability. It was a conversation that we had in our group, that how do we tackle those perpetrators who will not take accountability? And there's obviously some broad questions around, you know, the way we frame this in our justice system and all those sorts of things that are probably bigger than we can tackle right now. And the terminology, sometimes there are lots of ways in which we talk about this, but sometimes we just want to call it out for what it is, and it needs to make people uncomfortable because it is awful. So again, it's sort of going against some of the things that we've kind of been holding on to for the last few years, which is really interesting. We did have a little bit more, but I don't want to take up much time.
No. So Rich, and I know you'll have made many on this group, but also Lula and Michael very happy for the fact that you're going to take some of those things with your work tomorrow. So thank you. Before I want to break you into the next group, just to think of the kind of the short-term, medium and long-term quick ideas now as well. But is there anyone else that maybe wants to sort of say, what does it mean for primary prevention? What did your group talk about? What does it mean for the local region? Thanks, Fiona. You're on mute, my friend.
Of course. One of the things that we discussed is around the local region can play a part in advocacy with to support you, Lula, with your, you know, the need to get finances to do that research work. And, you know, if we can, as a region, we can support in whatever way to help secure those funds and say sort of how important it is for us to have that language and that data.
Yep.
That's something practical that we can do.
That is true. Because advocacy is one of the tools that primary prevention has and health promotion has. So yeah.
And
absolutely.
not just the women's health services, I mean, as well, not
Yes.
just the partnerships, but you know, those services that are doing men's change programs, so that we've got, you know, they've got better data to be able to do the work that they do as well in
Yep.
addressing and
Yep.
accountability.
Yep. Deb, we'll give you the last one and then we'll go into
Sorry.
the group quickly.
I'm
No,
just
don't be
jumping
sorry.
in because I'm in Ballarat and obviously we've had a
Oh,
huge
yeah.
focus on our region at the
Yep.
moment. So I've just been at a men's initiative event this morning where we had over 50 men from our local community who had come along expressing that they want to be part of the solution. And we've
Okay,
obviously
that's
got
fantastic.
a masculinities advisor within our organisation at the moment. And it was really interesting to seeing. I'm now thinking about everything I've learned here today, and just how do we make spaces even more welcoming for men so that they can come into them and we can have those conversations. And it's just, yeah, everything that's been said today, I've got so many notes that I'm going to be able to use straight
You're
away.
amazing.
So it's so good.
Our heart is with you, Deb. I know how hard it is at the moment. And what we might do with that one is I'm going to quickly put you back into those breakout groups. And if you go to the end of those that Google sheet that was shared with you, or you don't even have to, you know, capture on it and capture it some way. We just now want to know, and Deb started our thinking, right? And Fiona started our thinking, the advocacy, you know, what are the things you can do tomorrow, the medium term and the longer term? I think for WHISE, we really want to start creating this as part of the work that we do with our PrEP partnership moving forward. So this is really important, that practice. So I'm now going to break you into those rooms quite quickly. Quick fire, 5 minutes if that, before we bring you all back. All right, same group of people because you've built up a rapport with them. Here we go. I also want to just reflect on the fact that we had this conversation this morning about what it means for prevention already. So there's something that we can reflect on too. But over to you. Who'd like to share what came out for you in the discussions? Stephanie Cooper.
Hi. We were talking about how we talk about statistics and changing that narrative about victim-centric versus perpetrator-centric language. And Beverly from my group brought up that, you know, how do we go about working with presenting the positive statistics first? So, for example, you know, if you have 20% of men who think that misogynist comments are okay, generally you would report that 80% of men don't believe that misogynist comments are okay.
Yep.
So I sort of said, you know, maybe we can be putting it as, you know, 80% of men don't believe that misogynist comments are okay. So we call upon those 80% of men to join us by calling out the behaviour of the 20% who do, and using that as a sort of a way of recruiting those men who call themselves good men, who don't do these things. They're not perpetrators, but perhaps are bystanders.
Yep.
And inviting them to learn more about how to not be a bystander, how to call out those behaviours, and how to have a positive impact on the situation, rather than it being just enough that they don't do it themselves.
Yep.
So that was something we talked about in our group.
Amazing. Just reframing the language is amazing. I can see, Michael, you've got your hand up too.
Actually, it's me.
I know.
I've got my hand up. No, I really like that point from Stephanie. And in thinking about the most recent Man Box report from JSS, one of the key messages I thought we should take away from that was that 75% of men between 18 and 30 who were a part of that survey don't endorse the Man Box. You know, it's actually a shrinking number of men who believe or put weight into their social identity being attached to that Man Box. And how are we promoting that shift? Because that's a huge shift as far as, well, a huge part of the population. And how do we use that as a leverage to demonstrate you're these group of men are the odd ones out, essentially. You're the ones not living up to the social norms, and empower those 75% to really be seen and be heard. And how do we then, you know, the complexity is, while that is a traditional stereotype version of what a man should be, it's still what we promote endlessly as
Yes.
the ideal of men through our media, through our movies. You know, I can't remember where I picked this up, but some other advocate somewhere along the way made this incredibly good point that it isn't just the bad guys who use violence. The heroes in most of our stories use violence to
Yep.
solve their problems. So
Yep.
more and more, the heroes are the dark, brooding, mysterious types who are just not very good at their relationships. So what are we doing? Like, we're reinforcing this really negative stereotype in all these ways all the time. Michael will hear me go and I'm like, oh, can we not watch another US drama that paints like people who are really unhealthy and unable to carry on relationships as interesting for drama? Like, I'm really done. So we have some challenges about media representations, even though the growing populace is turning their back on that. It's still what we're fed. We are socializing and telling boys and men, this is what it is to be the good guy.
Yep.
Or
Yep.
the interesting one.
Yeah. And I can see Chrissy's just pointed out that, you know, gender compass, which is a different way of looking at it again, actually shows that high level of men do not believe in gender inequality as an issue at all. So, you know, the question is that ambivalence? Is that just thinking that everyone else is like themselves? Is that about, you know, just inertia even, I think, too.
If I may, I think there's strength in numbers. Like,
Yep.
we've done gender equality coaching with leaders and people who want to be advocates in this space. And one of the strategies we say is have a buddy, have someone who you know in your team meeting or in your workplace is going to back you up if you're the first person to speak up, because we are dealing the people who are, you know, can be sexist or can, you know, say really gross misogynistic things or, you know, use intimidation or blokey, you know, those gross ways of being a man can be quite threatening to other men. Like, we have to take in men's lived experience. Like, they might have been the bully at their school and now they're in their peer group or now they're in the workplace. But if you strength in numbers, know who your people are and know, like, if I speak up, you've got my back. If you speak up, I've got your back. And it's just that outnumbering them. It doesn't have to be aggressive. It's just a nudge and showing that you're in the minority.
So clearly more work to do, but in closing, I think Lula and Michael, thank you for such an inspiring, motivating and galvanizing, generous sharing of, I think, what is clearly a life's work for you. I think everyone on this this session today, certainly in the local region, has you know, been reinvigorated by it too. I know we've got people here at the moment from women from the Grampians, and hearts to them, but we've got people across Victoria who are struggling with this this issue. So you've given us more options, I think, is what I'll say.